The desert wind carried with it the silence of forgotten places, a silence broken only by the sound of a child's sobs, and when the Apache warrior drew his horse to a stop at the sight of the little girl sitting alone on a flat rock, her face streaked with dust and tears, he knew instinctively that the earth itself was presenting him with a choice that would alter both their lives. She looked up at him, her voice fragile but piercing, and whispered, "My mama left me here and said she would come back. It has been 3 days," and those words struck deeper than any arrow could, because within them lived both the faith of a child and the cruel weight of abandonment. And though the Apache had seen villages burn, families torn apart, and children wander lost into the wilderness, never had he heard a plea so simple and so devastating, for it was not shouted in anger or fear but spoken with the plain honesty of a heart too young to disguise its wounds. And for a long moment he remained still, remembering a time when he too had waited for someone who would never return, his own mother who had gone to fetch water and never came back, leaving him with nothing but the memory of her lullaby and the unyielding ache of loss. And so he dismounted, kneeling before the child, his strong, weathered hands resting on his knees as he studied her face, not with pity but with a searching kind of recognition, and she, sensing something in his gaze that was different from the others who had passed by, did not shrink away but clutched the hem of her faded yellow dress and repeated softly, "She said she would come back," as though the insistence could summon her mother from the horizon. The Apache could have told her the truth, that 3 days in the desert was too long, that survival was unlikely, but the words caught in his throat, for he realized that what she needed was not truth sharpened into cruelty but hope tempered with kindness. And so he said instead, "Then we will wait together. And if she does not return, I will help you find her." And with those words a fragile thread of trust was woven between them. He lifted her gently onto his horse, wrapping her in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar smoke, and though she resisted at first, crying that her mother might not find her if she left, he promised in a low, steady voice, "If your mother comes, she will not be alone. She will find both of us," and that assurance calmed her trembling enough that she let her small fingers clutch the horse's mane, and so began their journey together, not just across the desert but across the fragile terrain of healing and hope. Each village they entered, the Apache asked about a woman with dark hair and tired eyes, a woman who might have left her child behind, but no one had seen such a woman, and with each denial the girl's hope faltered a little, yet she never let it extinguish, clinging to the memory of her mother's promise as though it were water in the dry wasteland. And the Apache, watching her fight to believe, felt something stir within him, and ache not of sorrow this time but of purpose, for he realized that while he could not erase her pain, he could ensure she would not face it alone. At night by the fire, when her small body shook with silent sobs, he told her stories of stars that guided travelers home, of rivers that carried voices of the ancestors, and she, though still grieving, would fall asleep with her head against his chest, comforted not by answers but by presence. One evening she whispered that her mother used to sing to her when she was afraid, and though the Apache had not sung since his youth, he closed his eyes and let an old lullaby rise from deep memory, his voice rough at first but softening as he remembered the melody, and the girl, her tears still wet, drifted into sleep with the faintest smile on her lips, as though she had been returned for a moment to the comfort she had lost. Days turned into weeks, their search yielding no trace of the woman, and the Apache began to realize that his quest was no longer to find the mother but to give the girl a reason to believe that she had not been abandoned by the world itself. And in that realization came a turning point, for when they reached a settlement on the edge of the desert, where people gathered who had lost homes and kin, the Apache stood before them with the girl's small hand in his and said words that surprised even him, "This is my daughter." And though his voice was steady, inside him a storm raged, because in claiming her he was also claiming the part of himself that had long been buried beneath grief and solitude. The girl looked up at him in wonder, her eyes wide not with confusion but with relief, for in that moment she understood that family is not only who brings you into the world but who chooses to stay when the world has tried to leave you behind. And she threw her arms around his waist and wept, not from sorrow but from a release of the fear that had gripped her since the day her mother walked away. And though she never stopped whispering silent prayers that her mother might one day return, she grew in strength and laughter under the care of the man who had found her, who had chosen her, who had turned her waiting into a beginning instead of an ending. Years later, when she was grown, she would tell the story of that day, the day she sat alone in the desert, waiting for someone who never came, and how instead she was found by a stranger who became her father. And she would tell it not with bitterness but with gratitude, teaching others that the power of humanity is not in bloodlines or promises but in acts of compassion, in the courage to stay when it would be easier to walk away. And she would remind them that love is sometimes not the return we wait for but the unexpected arrival that changes everything, and in her voice would echo the lesson she had lived, that even in the harshest deserts of abandonment, kindness can bloom like a hidden spring, and from it can flow a future brighter than the past. The Apache, too, was transformed, for in saving her he found he had also saved himself, healing the wound of his own childhood loss by refusing to let hers define her, and together they built a life not defined by sorrow but by choice. A testament that the family we find can be just as real, just as sacred, as the family we are born into, and that sometimes, when the world breaks its promises, the heart is mended not by what returns but by who chooses to stay.